The rain fell softly on the small cemetery in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, as mourners gathered around the casket of Yumiko Callahan. She was 72 years old when she passed, leaving behind her 2 children, David and Sarah, and a lifetime of silence about her past. The funeral was modest, attended by neighbors who knew her as the quiet Japanese woman who never spoke about the war, never taught her children her native language, and never returned to Japan. As the last shovelful of earth covered her grave, David and Sarah stood side by side, feeling the weight of questions they had never asked, and answers they would never hear from her lips. The October sky hung low and gray, matching the mood of the small gathering. Mrs. Henderson from next door dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Patterson, who ran the hardware store where Everett had worked for 30 years, stood with his hat pressed against his chest. The Methodist minister said words about eternal rest and God's mercy, but David barely heard them. He was 45 years old, an accountant with a wife and 2 children in Philadelphia, and he realized with sudden sharp clarity that he had never really known his mother at all. Sarah stood beside her brother, her arm linked through his. She was 42, a high school English teacher in Pittsburgh, unmarried, dedicated to her students. She had always felt closer to their mother than David had, or at least she had tried to be, but even she had to admit that Yumiko had remained fundamentally unknowable, a presence in their lives that was somehow also an absence. Sarah remembered countless moments of trying to connect, asking about Japan, about her mother's childhood, about what it had been like to come to America. Every question had been met with the same gentle deflection, the same careful smile, the same quiet insistence that the past did not matter, only the present. 3 days after the funeral, David and Sarah returned to their childhood home to begin the painful process of sorting through their mother's belongings. The house felt empty without her presence, though she had always been more absence than presence, a shadow moving through rooms, cooking meals, folding laundry, but never truly revealing herself. Sarah walked through the kitchen, running her fingers over the countertops where her mother had prepared thousands of meals, always American food, never Japanese. Pot roast and mashed potatoes, meatloaf and green beans, apple pie and chocolate cake. Sarah had once asked her mother to make Japanese food, and Yumiko had looked at her with an expression Sarah could not read and said she did not remember how. It was a lie, Sarah realized now, one of many small lies that had built the wall between them. David stood in the living room staring at the photographs on the mantel, mostly pictures of him and Sarah as children, a few of their father Everett before he passed in 1979, but almost none of their mother alone. There was one photograph taken in 1948, shortly after she had arrived in America. She was standing in front of the house wearing a dress that looked too big for her thin frame, her hair styled in the American fashion of the time, her face serious and unsmiling. David had always thought she looked frightened in that photograph, but now he wondered if what he had mistaken for fear was actually determination. The attic was where they found it, tucked behind old Christmas decorations and boxes of their childhood toys. There was a small metal box, locked and covered in dust. It was military green, the kind soldiers used to store personal items during the war. David pried it open with a screwdriver, the lock giving way with a sharp crack that echoed in the quiet attic. Inside, wrapped in faded silk that might once have been a scarf, was a leather folder embossed with the letters GHQ Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were documents, yellowed with age, written in both English and Japanese, stamped with official seals, and at the bottom of the most important page, a signature that made both of them gasp: Dwight D. Eisenhower. The story began in Tokyo in the autumn of 1946. Japan was a nation in ruins, its cities reduced to ash and rubble by years of bombing. The firebombing campaign had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, leaving Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other cities as wastelands of charred wood and twisted metal. American soldiers filled the streets, part of the occupation force tasked with rebuilding and reshaping the defeated empire. General Douglas MacArthur ruled Japan as supreme commander, implementing reforms that would transform the country from a militaristic empire into a democratic nation. Among the thousands of soldiers stationed in Tokyo was Sergeant Everett Callahan, a 24-year-old farm boy from Pennsylvania who had survived the Pacific Campaign and now found himself stationed in a country he had been taught to hate. Everett had enlisted in 1943 at the age of 21, leaving behind the family farm and his widowed mother Constance. He had fought in the Philippines, seen friends die on beaches and in jungles, and had learned to hate the enemy with the fierce hatred that war demands. But now, walking through the ruins of Tokyo, seeing children begging for food and old women picking through rubble for anything salvageable, he found that hatred harder to maintain. These were not the faceless enemy of propaganda posters. These were people, broken and desperate, trying to survive. He was assigned to work with the intelligence division, helping to root out war criminals and members of the Kempeitai, the feared military police who had terrorized occupied territories throughout the war. It was work that required patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to see beyond the surface of things. Yumiko Tanaka was 21 years old in 1946, born in 1925, in a small village outside Kyoto. Her childhood had been one of beauty and learning. Her father, Takeshi Tanaka, had been a professor of English literature at Kyoto University, a gentleman who loved Shakespeare and Dickens, and who had filled their home with books in both Japanese and English. He had taught Yumiko to read English before she could read Japanese, reciting passages from Hamlet and Oliver Twist as bedtime stories. Her mother, Emiko, had been a traditional woman, skilled in tea ceremony and flower arrangement, but also quietly supportive of her husband's unconventional approach to raising their daughter. Yumiko had grown up between two worlds, Japanese tradition and Western literature, never quite belonging fully to either. The war had destroyed everything. In 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Takeshi's books became dangerous. Owning Western literature was seen as unpatriotic, possibly treasonous. He hid them in the walls of their house, but someone reported him. In 1944, the Kempeitai came. They arrested Takeshi, accusing him of being a spy, of corrupting Japanese youth with Western ideas. He was executed 3 weeks later. Yumiko and her mother fled to Tokyo, hoping to disappear into the anonymity of the city. But in March 1945, the Great Firebombing came. American B-29 bombers dropped incendiary bombs that turned Tokyo into an inferno. Emiko died in the flames. Yumiko survived by jumping into a canal, staying underwater as long as her lungs could bear, surfacing to a world on fire. She survived the rest of the war alone, moving from shelter to shelter, eating whatever she could find, speaking to no one about her father or her education. Speaking fluent English was dangerous during the war, a skill that could mark her as a traitor. But after the surrender in August 1945, that same skill became valuable. She found work as a clerk in a noodle shop near the American headquarters, serving soldiers and trying to survive in a city where food was scarce, and hope even scarcer. She was thin, her clothes were threadbare, and she had learned to make herself invisible, to avoid attention, to survive by being unnoticed. It was Captain Thaddeus Whitmore who first noticed her. He was a sharp-eyed intelligence officer from Boston, 32 years old, born in 1914, a Harvard graduate who had joined the Army in 1941 and had spent the war analyzing enemy communications and tracking down war criminals. He was tasked with identifying former Kempeitai officers who had destroyed their uniforms and melted back into civilian life. These men had committed atrocities across Asia, torturing prisoners, executing civilians, enforcing brutal occupation policies. Many of them were now pretending to be ordinary citizens hoping to escape justice. Whitmore needed help, someone who could speak both Japanese and English fluently, someone who could move through Japanese society without attracting attention, someone brave enough to risk their life for justice. He heard Yumiko speaking English to an American soldier one day in the noodle shop, her accent nearly perfect, her grammar flawless. He waited until her shift ended, then approached her outside speaking carefully in English. He introduced himself, explained his work, and asked if she would be willing to help the occupation authorities. The work would be dangerous, he explained. She would translate intercepted letters, listen to conversations in public places, and identify men who had committed atrocities. If discovered, she would be killed. Former Kempeitai officers were still dangerous, still connected, still willing to murder anyone they saw as a traitor. Yumiko looked at him with eyes that had already seen too much death, and asked him one question. "Did you know my father?" Whitmore did not understand. She explained briefly, without emotion, that the Kempeitai had executed her father for owning English books. Whitmore was silent for a moment, then said quietly that he was sorry, that he wished he could have stopped it. Yumiko said yes without hesitation. She would help him find the men who had destroyed her family and countless others. For 18 months, Yumiko worked in the shadows. She was given a small room in a building controlled by American intelligence, a single room with a cot, a desk, and a window that looked out onto the ruins of Tokyo. She was paid in cash and cigarettes, which she traded for rice and vegetables. She translated thousands of documents, letters written by former soldiers trying to contact each other, coded messages passed between men who feared prosecution. She memorized faces from photographs, then walked through markets and train stations, identifying men who thought they had escaped justice. It was terrifying work. She knew that if any of these men recognized her, if they realized what she was doing, she would disappear. People disappeared all the time in post-war Tokyo. Bodies were found in canals, in bombed-out buildings, in alleys. No one asked questions. Her information led to the arrest of 47 former Kempeitai officers over the course of those 18 months. Each arrest was a small victory, a tiny piece of justice in a world that had seen too much injustice. Among those arrested was Major Hiroshi Yamada, a man responsible for the torture and execution of hundreds of prisoners in occupied China. He had run a prison camp where prisoners were subjected to water torture, electric shocks, and worse. After the war, he had destroyed his uniform, grown a beard, and taken a job as a clerk in a shipping company. Yumiko identified him from a photograph, then followed him for 3 days, confirming his identity and his routine. Whitmore's team arrested him on a Thursday morning as he walked to work. He tried to run. He was shot in the leg and captured. At his trial, he was sentenced to death. Yumiko attended the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching the man who had destroyed so many lives finally face justice. He never looked at her. He never knew who had identified him. It was during this work that she met Sergeant Everett Callahan. He was assigned to escort her to a safe house after a particularly dangerous identification. She had identified a former Kempeitai lieutenant who was now working as a taxi driver, and Whitmore was concerned that the man's associates might have noticed her. Everett arrived at her room in an army jeep, his uniform crisp, his manner professional. They rode in silence through the ruined streets of Tokyo, past buildings that were nothing but shells, past children playing in the rubble, past women carrying water from communal wells. When they arrived at the safe house, a small apartment in a building controlled by the army, he asked her in halting, careful words if she was afraid. She told him she had been afraid every day since her father died, but that fear was just another part of living now. Something in her honesty broke through his soldier's reserve. He asked if she wanted to talk, and she found herself telling him about her father, about the books hidden in the walls, about her mother dying in the firebombing. He listened without interrupting, without offering empty comfort, just listening. When she finished, he told her about Pennsylvania, about the farm where he had grown up, about his father dying of a heart attack in 1943, about his mother trying to run the farm alone. He told her that he had hated Japan before he came here, but that now he just felt sad for everyone, for all the death and waste and suffering. He began volunteering for escort duty whenever she needed protection. They talked during those drives about Pennsylvania farms and Kyoto temples, about the absurdity of war and the possibility of peace. He asked her to teach him Japanese words, and she taught him simple phrases. "Hello, thank you, beautiful." She asked him to tell her about America, and he described autumn in Pennsylvania, leaves turning red and gold, harvest festivals, Thanksgiving dinners. He fell in love with her courage, with the quiet strength that allowed her to walk into danger every day without complaint. She fell in love with his gentleness, with the way he treated her not as a defeated enemy or a useful asset, but as a person, someone worth knowing. By the spring of 1947, Everett had made up his mind. He wanted to marry Yumiko and bring her back to America. He proposed to her in a quiet moment in the safe house, offering her a ring he had bought from another soldier, a simple gold band with a small diamond. She said yes, but both of them knew the legal reality was brutal. The Immigration Act of 1924 explicitly barred Japanese immigrants from entering the United States. The law had been passed in an era of racial fear and prejudice, designed to keep America white and to exclude Asians entirely. Even the War Brides Act of 1945, which allowed soldiers to bring home wives from Europe and other parts of Asia, had initially excluded Japanese women. The thinking was clear. Germans and Italians could be forgiven, could be seen as potential Americans, but Japanese could not. By 1947, the law had been amended under pressure from soldiers who had fallen in love with Japanese women, but the bureaucratic and racial barriers remained enormous. Applications from Japanese war brides were scrutinized with suspicion, delayed for months, often rejected outright on vague grounds of national security or moral character. Everett submitted Yumiko's application in May 1947. It was denied in July for vague reasons related to national security concerns. The letter was brief and impersonal, stating only that her application had been reviewed and found insufficient. He submitted again in September, this time including letters of recommendation from his commanding officer and from other soldiers who had worked with him. Denied again in November, this time with an even briefer letter. Captain Whitmore tried to intervene, writing letters explaining Yumiko's service to the occupation, detailing the arrests she had made possible, arguing that she had earned the right to immigrate. His letters disappeared into the bureaucracy, lost in the maze of offices and officials who saw only a Japanese woman trying to enter America. Everett grew desperate. His unit was scheduled to return to the United States in early 1948, and he could not leave Yumiko behind. He knew what would happen to her if her identity as an intelligence asset became known. The men she had helped arrest had families, had friends, had connections to nationalist groups that were already beginning to organize in the chaos of post-war Japan. If they discovered what she had done, they would kill her. It would be slow and brutal, a message to anyone else who had helped the Americans. He could not let that happen. In December 1947, he did something that should have been impossible for a sergeant. He wrote a letter directly to General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not in Japan. He had returned to the United States in 1945 and was now serving as Chief of Staff of the Army, one of the most powerful military positions in the country. He was 57 years old in 1947, a national hero, the man who had commanded the Allied forces in Europe and accepted Germany's surrender. Writing to him was absurd, the equivalent of a private citizen writing to the president and expecting a response. But Everett was desperate, and desperation makes people attempt the impossible. The letter was 6 pages long, handwritten in Everett's careful script. He explained who he was, where he was stationed, and who Yumiko was. He detailed her work for Captain Whitmore, the arrests she had made possible, the danger she faced. He explained the legal barriers, the repeated denials, the bureaucratic indifference. He wrote about her father's execution, her mother's death, her courage in the face of loss. He explained that former Kempeitai officers were still at large, that some had connections to nationalist groups who would see her as a traitor. He begged the general to intervene, not as a favor, but as a matter of justice for someone who had risked everything to help the occupation succeed. He ended the letter with a simple plea. She served with honor. She deserves to live without fear. Please help her. He mailed the letter knowing it would probably never reach Eisenhower's desk, knowing that even if it did, a 5-star general would never involve himself in the visa application of one Japanese woman. He was wrong. Eisenhower received thousands of letters every month, most of them handled by aides who responded with form letters. But something about Everett's letter caught the attention of a young lieutenant who was sorting mail that day. Perhaps it was the handwritten pages, the obvious sincerity, the detailed account of Yumiko's service. The lieutenant passed it up the chain of command, and somehow, miraculously, it reached Eisenhower's desk. The general read it one evening in January 1948, sitting in his office in Washington. He read it twice, then called for his aide and asked for more information about Yumiko Tanaka. The aide contacted Captain Whitmore in Tokyo, who confirmed everything Everett had written and added more details about the specific cases Yumiko had helped solve. Eisenhower made his decision quickly. This woman had served. She had risked her life. She deserved protection and a chance at a new life. He signed the authorization himself, a special order granting Yumiko Tanaka permission to enter the United States as the wife of Sergeant Everett Callahan, bypassing the normal immigration process on grounds of national interest and personal safety. In January 1948, a staff car arrived at Everett's barracks in Tokyo. An aide to General Eisenhower, a major who had flown in from Washington specifically for this purpose, handed him an envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a special authorization for Yumiko Tanaka to enter the United States as the wife of Sergeant Everett Callahan, signed personally by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Attached was a brief note in the general's handwriting. "This woman served with honor. She has earned her place." The signature was unmistakable, bold and clear. The signature of a man who had commanded armies and shaped history. Everett stood holding the paper, unable to speak, tears running down his face. The major smiled and said that the general wanted Sergeant Callahan to know that America was grateful for his service and for the service of his future wife. The authorization included a recommendation that Yumiko's work remain classified and that she be allowed to live under her married name without public acknowledgement of her service. It was, in effect, a witness protection order signed by one of the most powerful men in the world. Yumiko and Everett were married in a small ceremony at the American Chapel in Tokyo in February 1948. Captain Whitmore attended as a witness, along with a few of Everett's friends from his unit. Yumiko wore a simple white dress that Everett had bought for her, and she carried a small bouquet of flowers. There was no family on either side, no traditional Japanese ceremony, no celebration, just two people making promises to each other in a chapel surrounded by the ruins of war. Whitmore gave Yumiko a gift after the ceremony, a leather folder embossed with the GHQ seal. Inside was a copy of Eisenhower's authorization, along with letters documenting her service. He told her to keep it safe, that someday she might need proof of what she had done, or that someday she might want her children to know. She thanked him quietly and tucked the folder into her suitcase. 2 weeks later, Yumiko boarded a military transport ship bound for San Francisco. She carried one suitcase containing a few clothes, her father's English dictionary, the only possession she had managed to save from her old life, and the leather folder with Eisenhower's signature, hidden in a secret pocket she had sewn into the lining. She left behind her name, her language, and her past. She was 23 years old, and she was leaving the only country she had ever known to travel to a place where she would be seen as the enemy, as the other, as someone who did not belong. Everett held her hand as the ship pulled away from the dock, and she watched Japan disappear into the mist, wondering if she would ever see it again. The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks. The ship was crowded with soldiers returning home and a handful of war brides, women from Japan, Korea, and the Philippines who had married American soldiers. The Japanese women kept to themselves, aware that they were the least welcome, the most resented. Some of the soldiers stared at them with open hostility. One man spat at Yumiko's feet as she walked past. Everett confronted him, and there was a brief scuffle before officers broke it up. After that, Everett stayed close to Yumiko at all times, his presence a shield against the hatred. The ship arrived in San Francisco in March 1948. Yumiko stepped onto American soil wearing the dress Everett had bought for her, her hair styled in the American fashion, her face carefully composed. She was processed through immigration, her special authorization examined with suspicion by officials who had never seen such a document. One officer, a man in his 50s with a face like granite, asked her directly if she was a spy. She looked him in the eye and said nothing. Everett squeezed her hand and stepped forward, his voice hard, asking the officer if he was questioning General Eisenhower's judgment. The officer backed down, stamping her papers with obvious reluctance, and they were waved through. They traveled by train to Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, a small farming town where Everett had grown up. The journey took 4 days, crossing landscapes that seemed impossibly vast to Yumiko, who had never been outside Japan. She saw mountains and deserts, plains and forests, cities and small towns. America was enormous, overwhelming, and she felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller as the train carried her farther from everything she had known. Everett tried to prepare her for what was coming, explaining that his mother was a difficult woman, that she had lost her husband and her oldest son to the war, that she blamed Japan for everything. He told Yumiko that it would take time, that his mother would come around eventually, but Yumiko could see the doubt in his eyes. Constance Callahan was waiting at the station when they arrived. She was 58 years old, born in 1890, a woman who had lived through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, who had buried a husband and a son, who had worked the farm alone for years while Everett was overseas. When she saw Yumiko step off the train, her face turned to stone. She did not embrace her. She did not smile. She looked at her son and said in a voice loud enough for the other people on the platform to hear, "You married one of them." The words hung in the air like a slap. Everett's face flushed with anger, but Yumiko touched his arm gently, stopping him from responding. She understood. This woman had lost everything to the war, and Yumiko represented the enemy, the people who had killed her son, who had started the war that had destroyed so many lives. Words would not change that. Only time might. The first months in Willow Creek were a kind of war Yumiko had not prepared for. Constance refused to eat meals with her, refused to speak to her directly, communicated only through Everett. She made it clear that Yumiko was not welcome in her house, that she was there only because Everett insisted. The neighbors stared openly, whispered behind her back. Children threw stones at the windows of the small house Everett had rented in town. Someone painted the word Jap on their front door in red paint. Yumiko cleaned it off without comment, scrubbing until her hands were raw, saying nothing to Everett about it because she did not want to cause him more pain. She learned to shop at the grocery store during hours when fewer people were there, early in the morning or late in the evening. She learned to keep her eyes down, to make herself small and invisible, to move through the town like a ghost. Everett defended her fiercely, confronting neighbors, arguing with his mother, getting into a fistfight with a man who called Yumiko a slur in the hardware store. But Yumiko asked him to stop. She told him that anger would only make things worse, that time and silence were her only weapons. Slowly, painfully, the hostility began to soften. Yumiko volunteered at the Methodist church, cleaning and organizing, never asking for recognition or thanks. She scrubbed floors, polished pews, arranged flowers, all without speaking unless spoken to. The minister's wife, Mrs. Patterson, was the first to show her kindness, offering her a cup of tea one day after church and asking her about Japan. Yumiko spoke carefully, choosing her words, talking about cherry blossoms and temples, avoiding anything about the war. Mrs. Patterson listened, and the next Sunday she invited Yumiko to join the church ladies' auxiliary. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. Yumiko helped a neighbor's child with homework one afternoon. The child, a boy named Tommy who was struggling with reading, had been playing in the street when Yumiko walked by. He dropped his book, and she picked it up, noticing that it was a primer for 3rd grade. She asked him gently if he needed help, and he nodded, too young to have learned to hate her yet. She sat with him on his front porch and helped him sound out words, her English perfect and patient. His mother came out and found them, and for a moment, Yumiko thought the woman would be angry. Instead, she thanked Yumiko quietly and asked if she would be willing to help Tommy again. Yumiko said yes, and twice a week she tutored the boy. His reading improved, and his mother began greeting Yumiko on the street, a small nod of acknowledgement that felt like a victory. She brought food to Constance when she was ill, leaving it outside her door without a word. Constance had caught pneumonia in the winter of 1950, and Everett was frantic with worry. Yumiko made soup, rich and nourishing, and left it on the porch of Constance's farmhouse every day for 2 weeks. Constance never thanked her, never acknowledged the gesture, but she ate the soup, and she recovered. Constance began to soften, bit by bit, year by year. She never apologized for her coldness, never admitted that she had been wrong. But one day in 1952, she invited Yumiko to sit at the table for Sunday dinner. It was the closest thing to acceptance Yumiko would ever receive, and she took it gratefully. David was born in 1950, a healthy baby boy with his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair. Yumiko held him for the first time in the hospital, feeling a love so fierce it frightened her. She promised him silently that she would protect him, that he would never know the kind of fear and loss she had known, that he would grow up American, safe, and loved. Sarah was born in 1953, a beautiful baby girl who cried less than David had, and who seemed to watch the world with serious, thoughtful eyes. Yumiko raised them as American children. She spoke only English to them, cooked only American food, celebrated only American holidays. She never taught them Japanese words, never told them stories about Kyoto, never explained why she had left Japan. When David was 5 years old, he asked her why she looked different from the other mothers. She told him that she was from Japan, but that she was American now just like him. When he asked what Japan was like, she said she did not remember very well, that it had been a long time. It was a lie, but it was a lie she told to protect him. When Sarah was 7, she came home from school crying because another child had called her mother a Jap. Yumiko held her daughter, wiping away her tears, and told her that some people were unkind, but that their unkindness did not matter. She did not tell Sarah about the stones thrown at their windows, about the slurs painted on their door, about the years of silence and invisibility. She wanted her children to grow up without that burden. When David asked her once why she never talked about the war, she said simply that the past was the past and should stay there. When Sarah asked if she missed Japan, she said she did not remember it well enough to miss it. The children grew up knowing their mother was Japanese, but knowing nothing about what that meant. They did not know about Kyoto, about their grandfather's library, about their grandmother's tea ceremonies. They did not know about the Kempeitai, about the men their mother had helped bring to justice, about the danger she had faced. They knew only that their mother was quiet, that she kept to herself, that she was different from the other mothers in ways they could not quite articulate. Everett understood her silence. He never pushed her to speak about Tokyo, about the work she had done, about the danger she had escaped. He kept the leather folder hidden in the attic, locked in the metal box, a secret they shared but never discussed. He worked at the local hardware store, a job that paid modestly but steadily. He coached David's Little League baseball team, teaching his son to throw and catch, cheering from the sidelines at games. He taught Sarah to ride a bicycle, running alongside her until she found her balance, catching her when she fell. He was a good father and a devoted husband, and he loved Yumiko with a quiet, steady love that never demanded more than she could give. When he died of a heart attack in 1979 at the age of 57, Yumiko mourned him quietly, never crying in front of the children, never explaining that he had been the only person in America who truly knew her. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church, and the town turned out to pay their respects. Everett had been well liked, a veteran who had served his country, a man who worked hard and treated people fairly. Yumiko sat in the front pew with David and Sarah on either side of her, her face composed, her hands folded in her lap. After the service, people came up to offer their condolences and she thanked them politely, her voice steady. Only Mrs. Patterson, now elderly herself, seemed to see through the composure. She took Yumiko's hand and squeezed it gently, saying nothing, just offering the comfort of human touch. She lived alone for 6 more years after his death. David had moved to Philadelphia after college, working as an accountant for a firm downtown. He had married a woman named Linda in 1975, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Sarah had become a high school English teacher in Pittsburgh, dedicated to her students, pouring into them the love and attention she had always wished her mother could give her. They visited on holidays, dutiful but distant, never quite understanding the wall their mother had built around herself. Yumiko spent her days tending a small garden behind the house, growing tomatoes and beans and flowers. She read library books, mostly mysteries and romances, stories about other people's lives. She attended church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew, singing hymns in her careful English. She never remarried, never traveled, never returned to Japan. In 1985, she was diagnosed with cancer. The doctor, a young man who had not been born when she arrived in America, explained that it was advanced, that treatment would be difficult and might not work. She declined aggressive treatment, choosing instead to live out her remaining time in peace. She moved into the hospital in Willow Creek in September, and David and Sarah took turns staying with her. She died on a Tuesday morning in October, holding Sarah's hand, her last words in English. "I tried to be a good mother." Sarah assured her that she had been, that they loved her, but Yumiko's eyes had already closed and Sarah would never know if she heard. Now, 3 days after the funeral, David and Sarah sat in the attic surrounded by dust and memories, reading documents that rewrote everything they thought they knew about their mother. The folder contained Captain Whitmore's reports, detailing Yumiko's work identifying Kempeitai officers. Each report was clinical, professional, listing dates and names and outcomes. Arrested, tried, convicted, executed. 47 men, each one a monster who had tortured and killed. Each one brought to justice because of their mother's courage. There were photographs of some of the men she had helped arrest, their faces marked with red ink, notes in the margins detailing their crimes. Major Hiroshi Yamada, responsible for the deaths of over 300 prisoners. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, who had personally executed 27 civilians suspected of helping the resistance. Captain Takeshi Ito, who had run a brothel where women were held as sex slaves. The list went on, each name a testament to the work their mother had done in secret. There were letters from Everett to military officials, pleading for her visa. David recognized his father's handwriting, the careful script, the earnest tone. Each letter was more desperate than the last, explaining Yumiko's service, arguing for her right to enter America, begging for help. There was the letter to Eisenhower, 6 pages of heartfelt plea, every word written with the knowledge that it was probably futile. And there was the authorization itself, signed by the general, explaining in formal language that Yumiko Tanaka had provided invaluable service to the occupation and was hereby granted special permission to immigrate as a matter of national interest and personal safety. Sarah read aloud the section that explained why Yumiko's identity had to be protected. Several of the men she had identified had connections to nationalist groups that remained active in Japan. If her role became known, she would be targeted for assassination. The authorization included a recommendation that her work remain classified and that she be allowed to live under her married name without public acknowledgement of her service. It was, in effect, a witness protection order signed by one of the most powerful men in the world. Eisenhower had not just granted her a visa, he had given her a new life, a chance to escape the past and build a future. David sat back, his mind reeling. Their mother had not been a simple war bride. She had been a spy, an intelligence asset, a woman who had risked her life to bring war criminals to justice. She had been hunted, protected by Eisenhower himself, and had spent 40 years in silence not because she was ashamed of her past, but because speaking about it could have gotten her killed. Every moment of her quietness, her refusal to teach them Japanese, her insistence on being invisible, had been an act of protection, not just for herself, but for them. If the wrong people had learned who she was, what she had done, they might have come for her, and David and Sarah might have been caught in the crossfire. Sarah found a small envelope at the bottom of the folder, addressed to her and David in their mother's handwriting. The handwriting was shaky, written in the last weeks of her life when the cancer had weakened her. Inside was a letter, written in English, dated 1 week before Yumiko's death. She had known she was dying, and had left this for them to find. The letter was brief, just 2 pages, but every word carried the weight of 40 years of silence. My dear David and Sarah, the letter began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the box I hid in the attic. I have wanted to tell you the truth many times, but I was afraid. Afraid that you would see me differently. Afraid that the past would reach forward and hurt you. Afraid that I would lose the fragile peace I built in America. I want you to know that everything I did, every moment of silence, every unanswered question was to protect you. The work I did in Tokyo was necessary, but it made me enemies. Dangerous men who would have killed me if they knew who I was. Your father understood. He kept my secret, and he loved me anyway. I hope you can understand, too. I came to America because I had nowhere else to go. Japan was ash and ghosts, and I could not stay there. But I also came because your father made me believe that I could have a future, that I could be more than a survivor. He was wrong about some things. I never stopped being a survivor. But he was right that I could have a family, that I could love and be loved. You were my future, both of you. Every day I spent with you was a day I chose life over the past. I know I was not the mother you deserved. I know I was distant, that I kept secrets, that I could not give you the warmth and openness you needed. I'm sorry for that. But I want you to know that I loved you more than I can say, that every silent moment was filled with words I could not speak. I am proud of you, David, for the man you have become, for the family you have built. I am proud of you, Sarah, for the teacher you are, for the way you give to your students what I could not give to you. Do not be angry with your father for keeping my secret. He did it because I asked him to, because we both believed it was the only way to keep you safe. Do not be angry with me for the silence. It was the only gift I knew how to give you. The letter ended with a sentence in Japanese, the only Japanese words in the entire folder. Watashi wa anata tachi o hokori ni omote imasu. I am proud of you. David and Sarah sat together in the attic as the afternoon light faded, holding the letter, crying for the mother they had never truly known and now never could. They understood now why she had been so quiet, why she had built walls around herself, why she had never gone back to Japan. She had not been running from her past. She had been protecting them from it. Every silent dinner, every unanswered question, every moment of distance had been an act of love, twisted and imperfect, but love nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, David and Sarah decided what to do with the documents. They contacted military historians at the Army War College, who confirmed that Yumiko's work had indeed been classified and that her role in identifying war criminals had been significant. The historians were excited by the discovery, explaining that very few records of individual intelligence assets from the occupation had survived. Yumiko's story was a rare glimpse into the hidden work that had helped bring justice to post-war Japan. Captain Thaddeus Whitmore had died in 1982 at the age of 68, but they found his family in Boston. His daughter, now in her 50s, remembered her father speaking once about a brave Japanese woman who had helped him in Tokyo. He had never mentioned her name, respecting the classification, but he had said she was one of the most courageous people he had ever met. They contacted the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, which confirmed the authenticity of the signature and added the documents to their archives as an example of the general's personal intervention in matters of justice. The archivist explained that Eisenhower had occasionally signed special authorizations for people he believed deserved help, but that such interventions were rare and usually involved extraordinary circumstances. Yumiko's case was unique, a combination of her service, the danger she faced, and Everett's heartfelt plea. They also decided to share their mother's story publicly. In 1986, a local newspaper in Willow Creek published an article about Yumiko Callahan, the war bride whose visa had been signed by Eisenhower, the intelligence asset who had lived in silence for 40 years. The article was picked up by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, then by the Philadelphia Inquirer, and eventually by a national magazine. Letters arrived from other Japanese war brides, women who had faced similar struggles, similar silence, similar secrets. Some had also worked for the occupation, translating documents or identifying war criminals. Some had also been protected, their identities hidden to keep them safe. All of them had lived in the shadow of a war that never truly ended, carrying secrets that weighed on them every day. One letter came from a woman named Michiko, who had married an American soldier and moved to California in 1949. She wrote that she had also worked as a translator for the occupation and had helped identify members of a smuggling ring that was moving stolen art and weapons out of Japan. She had never told her children, had lived in silence for 37 years, and had only recently decided to share her story after reading about Yumiko. She thanked David and Sarah for bringing their mother's story to light, saying that it gave her the courage to tell her own truth. David and Sarah also began learning Japanese. They contacted a professor at the University of Pittsburgh who taught Japanese language and culture. The professor, a woman named Dr. Tanaka, no relation to Yumiko, agreed to tutor them. They started with the basics, learning hiragana and katakana, the two phonetic alphabets, then moving on to simple kanji characters. The first sentence their mother had written, "I am proud of you," became their touchstone. They practiced it over and over, writing the characters until they could do it from memory. Dr. Tanaka was patient and encouraging, explaining that learning Japanese as adults was difficult but rewarding. She also taught them about Japanese history and culture, filling in the gaps their mother had left. They learned about Kyoto, the ancient capital, a city of temples and gardens that had been spared from bombing during the war because of its cultural significance. They learned about the occupation, about the reforms MacArthur had implemented, about the struggle to rebuild a shattered nation. They learned about the Kempeitai, about the atrocities they had committed, about the difficulty of bringing them to justice. They learned about the Japanese war brides, about the 45,000 women who had come to America between 1947 and 1964, about the discrimination they had faced, about the courage it had taken to build lives in a country that did not want them. They visited Japan in 1987, 40 years after their mother had left. They flew into Tokyo, a modern city of skyscrapers and neon lights, almost unrecognizable from the ruined city their mother had known. They visited the neighborhood where she had worked, now a bustling commercial district with no trace of the past. They took a train to Kyoto, walking through the streets their mother had walked as a child. They visited temples and gardens, imagining their mother as a young girl, learning tea ceremony and flower arrangement, reading Shakespeare with her father. They visited the village where she had been born, now a suburb of Kyoto, modern and prosperous. They found the site where her family's house had stood, now occupied by an apartment building. They placed flowers at a memorial for civilians who had died in the war, saying a prayer for their grandmother Emiko and their grandfather Takeshi, people they had never known but who had shaped their mother's life. In Willow Creek, they worked with the local historical society to create a small exhibit about their mother's life. It included photographs, the one from 1948 showing Yumiko standing in front of the house, serious and unsmiling, and others from later years, showing her in the garden, at church with David and Sarah as children. It included documents from the folder, copies of Whitmore's reports, Everett's letters, and Eisenhower's authorization. They included a section about the other Japanese war brides who had come to America, the discrimination they had faced, and the quiet courage it had taken to build lives in a country that did not want them. The exhibit became a permanent installation at the Willow Creek Historical Society, a reminder that history is not just made by generals and presidents, but by ordinary people who do extraordinary things and then live with the consequences in silence. Constance Callahan had died in 1981 at the age of 91, 2 years after her son Everett. She never knew the truth about Yumiko's past, never learned about the work she had done, or the danger she had faced. David and Sarah wondered sometimes if she would have treated their mother differently if she had known, if the knowledge that Yumiko had served America would have softened her prejudice sooner. They would never know. But they did find in Constance's belongings a small box containing letters she had written, but never sent. One of them, dated 1975, was addressed to Yumiko. In it, Constance apologized for the years of coldness, admitted that she had been wrong to judge Yumiko based on her nationality, and thanked her for being a good wife to Everett and a good mother to David and Sarah. She wrote that she had come to respect Yumiko, to admire her quiet strength and her dedication to her family. She had never been able to say the words out loud, but she had written them down, and that was something. David and Sarah made a copy of the letter and placed it in the exhibit, a testament to the possibility of change, even if it comes too late. The story of Yumiko Callahan became part of the larger history of Japanese war brides, a chapter in the complex and often painful story of post-war reconciliation. Historians noted that while approximately 45,000 Japanese women came to America as war brides between 1947 and 1964, very few had their visas signed by Eisenhower himself. Yumiko's case was unique not just because of the signature, but because of what it represented. A moment when a powerful man recognized that justice and compassion were not weaknesses, but duties. Eisenhower had been a soldier, a man who had seen the worst of war, and he understood that sometimes the right thing to do was to help one person, to sign one piece of paper, to make one small act of justice in a world that desperately needed it. David kept the leather folder in a safe in his home in Philadelphia. He showed it to his own children, now teenagers, explaining who their grandmother had been, why she had been silent, and why her silence had been a kind of strength. His son, named Everett after his grandfather, asked if he could write a school report about Yumiko. David said yes, and together they researched the occupation, the Kempeitai, and the Japanese war brides. The report won a prize at his school, and Everett gave a presentation about his great-grandmother to his class. Some of the students had never heard of Japanese war brides. Some did not know about the occupation. Everett's presentation opened their eyes to a part of history that is often forgotten. Sarah used the story in her classroom, teaching her students about the complexities of war, the courage of immigrants, and the importance of asking questions before it is too late. She had her students interview their own grandparents, asking them about their lives, their struggles, their secrets. Many students discovered stories they had never known, family histories that had been hidden or forgotten. Sarah told them that everyone has a story, that everyone carries secrets, and that it is our job to listen, to understand, and to remember. Both David and Sarah lived with the knowledge that they had missed the chance to truly know their mother, but also with the understanding that she had given them the greatest gift she could, a safe and peaceful life, bought with her silence. They wished they could have told her that they understood, that they were not angry, that they loved her for who she was, not just for who she pretended to be, but they could not, and so they did the next best thing. They told her story, making sure that her courage would not be forgotten. In 2005, 20 years after Yumiko's death, the United States government formally acknowledged the contributions of Japanese war brides to American society. A small ceremony was held in Washington, attended by surviving war brides and their families. The ceremony was part of a larger effort to recognize the contributions of Asian Americans to the country, acknowledging decades of discrimination and exclusion. David and Sarah were invited to speak about their mother. David read from the letter Eisenhower had written, his voice steady, explaining how a five-star general had taken the time to help one woman because it was the right thing to do. Sarah read from their mother's final letter, her voice breaking on the Japanese words at the end. Watashi wa anatatachi o hokori ni omote imasu. I am proud of you. The audience, many of them children and grandchildren of war brides, stood and applauded, not just for Yumiko, but for all the women who had crossed an ocean, faced hatred and suspicion, and built lives in a country that had not welcomed them. After the ceremony, several people approached David and Sarah to share their own stories. A woman named Grace, whose mother had come from Japan in 1952, told them that her mother had also worked for the occupation, helping to set up schools for Japanese children. A man named Robert, whose mother had come from Korea in 1954, told them that his mother had faced similar discrimination and had also kept her past secret. An elderly woman named Hana, who had come to America herself in 1948, told them that she had known Yumiko briefly in Tokyo, that they had worked in the same building. She remembered Yumiko as quiet and serious, always focused on her work. She said that many of the women who had worked for the occupation had lived in silence, afraid of retribution, afraid of judgment. She thanked David and Sarah for telling Yumiko's story, saying that it gave voice to all the women who had never been able to speak. The metal box that had held the documents now sits in the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, part of a permanent exhibit on post-war immigration and reconciliation. The exhibit is called Bridges Across the Pacific, and it tells the story of the Japanese war brides, the challenges they faced and the contributions they made. Visitors can see Eisenhower's signature, bold and clear, a reminder that history is shaped by small acts of courage and large acts of compassion. Next to the box is a photograph of Yumiko, taken in 1948 shortly after she arrived in America. She is young, her face serious, her eyes looking directly at the camera. She does not smile, but there is something in her expression that suggests strength, resilience, and a quiet determination to survive. The placard next to the photograph explains who she was and what she did, detailing her work identifying Kempeitai officers and her role in bringing war criminals to justice. David and Sarah visit the exhibit every few years. They stand in front of their mother's photograph reading the placard, remembering the woman who raised them. Tourists stop and read, some taking photographs, some asking questions. David and Sarah answer when they can, sharing stories about the woman who cooked them breakfast, helped with homework, and attended school plays, never once hinting at the extraordinary life she had lived before they were born. They tell visitors that their mother was not a hero in the traditional sense, that she never sought recognition or fame, that she would probably be embarrassed by the exhibit. But they also say that heroism is not always loud, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is live quietly, protect the people they love, and carry their secrets to the grave. The story ends where it began, in the small cemetery in Willow Creek, where Yumiko Callahan rests beside her husband Everett. Her gravestone is simple, marked only with her name, the years 1925 to 1985, and a single line, beloved wife and mother. There is no mention of Tokyo, of the Kempeitai, of Eisenhower's signature, but visitors who know the story sometimes leave small stones on her grave, a Japanese tradition of respect and remembrance. David and Sarah visit on her birthday every year, October 15th, bringing flowers and speaking to her in the Japanese they learned too late. They tell her about their lives, their children, the exhibit, the letters from other families who found courage in her story. They tell her that they understand now, that they forgive the silence, that they are proud of her. And in the quiet of the cemetery, with the Pennsylvania wind moving through the trees and the October leaves falling like memories, it is easy to imagine that somewhere, somehow, she hears them and knows that her secret, kept for 40 years to protect the people she loved, has finally been told, not as a story of shame or regret, but as a story of courage, sacrifice, and a love that transcended borders, languages, and the long shadow of war. Her legacy lives on in her children, in her grandchildren, in the students who learn her story, and in the countless people who find inspiration in the quiet strength of a woman who survived the worst of humanity and chose to build a life of peace. If you enjoyed this story about courage and hidden histories, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What secrets do you think your own family might be keeping? Have you ever discovered something about your parents or grandparents that changed how you saw them? Let's keep these important stories alive together.